Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. So, in this episode, I wanted to touch on the defense of Taiwan, and I wanted to talk about this a little bit more because of some recent statements that have been mentioned by U.S. Naval personnel, specifically the commander of the Indo-Pacific Area of Operations, made the statement that he believed that within 6 years we could see we could see China, the People's Liberation Army, and Navy and Air Force make an attempt to seize Taiwan. And I wanted to talk about what I felt were the 5 layers of defense for Taiwan. And I believe that the defense of Taiwan can be broken down into 5 separate layers. And in each of these layers of defenses, China would have to obviously win all 5, and Taiwan would only need to win 1 of these 5 steps, these 5 layers, what I believe would be the conquest of Taiwan, meaning the main island. Now, possibly China could get away with achieving 4 of these, the first 4 of these layers, and could possibly claim victory. But I think there's a 5th element that would come into play, and I'll discuss that. But again, Taiwan would only need to win 1 of these 5 layers of defenses in order to be victorious. So let's start with the first layer of the defense of Taiwan. And that layer is going to be actually closer to mainland China. This is going to involve the actual buildup of forces, and then finally the kickoff of the actual operation. That would be the intent to seize the mainland island of Taiwan. And then they would also look at seizing Kinmen Island, which is here, and there's some other islands as well. But this would be phase 1, and it could be an option for the People's Liberation Army to leapfrog over Kinmen. However, I think it would probably be more likely that they would need to seize the island rather quickly to prevent strikes on cities near Kinmen. As you can see, there's some very industrial, urbanized, built-up areas near Kinmen and within the range of Taiwanese artillery. So the first phase in the defense would be obviously Kinmen and these other islands, but at the same time, we would also see air activity near this area. We would also see possible ballistic missile strikes and cruise missile strikes by Taiwan against targets deep in mainland China, such as sensitive economic targets or sensitive military targets, as many as 1,000 miles inland. So that is a definite possibility. Could there be enough casualties, enough port strikes by the Taiwanese military that could see the Chinese stopping during phase 1, or the first layer of this operation? I would say that would probably be doubtful, but possible. We would learn very quick just how effective some of Taiwan's missiles in fact are, and if in fact they are incredibly accurate, and we are seeing activity on the part of the Taiwanese Air Force that is causing great havoc against the People's Liberation Army Air Force, then we could see a stoppage during phase 1 of the operation, a pause, a rethink of the PLA, rethinking their operation just in terms if they're actually ready to do this because of the casualties and the targets that are being hit by Taiwan. So if phase 1 is successful, then I envision phase 2, and that would be more of a naval and air campaign with the goal of seizing the Straits of Taiwan. I would say the midline area up to Penghu Island here, and this would be another target for phase 2 of the Chinese operation. And this is where it becomes more difficult for China, because we're looking at a very significant amphibious landing against Penghu and these what I would define as the mid islands in the kind of in the middle of the Straits of Taiwan. We would see continued air campaign by the Chinese. We would see continued Chinese ballistic missile strikes on targets inside of Taiwan. But we would see, I would believe we would see heavy air-to-air engagements during this phase of the operation. And again, could it become so bloody for the Chinese in terms of taking these islands? I do not believe they could leapfrog these islands. They would need to secure these islands for the actual bigger piece of the prize, which would be mainland Taiwan. So this would be crucial to be seized by Taiwan, or I'm sorry, by China. And could we see such significant casualties during this landing? Could we see such significant casualties in terms of anti-ship missile strikes against naval assets of the Chinese Navy, that phase 2 could then see a defeat of China and a pause in operation, a stoppage in the operations, and thus a strategic defeat for China? I think that becomes more likely with phase 2 of the operation. Now, if phase 2 is successful and the Chinese do indeed end up having the ability of seizing Penghu and have achieved air supremacy over the Straits of Taiwan, and are now looking at what I would define as phase 3. And again, any of these phases, if China loses, Taiwan wins. So phase 3 is the near approaches to Taiwan. This is as the amphibious ships, as naval vessels start to approach within the 10-mile zone of the island of Taiwan. Now, this is not quite the amphibious phase. This is just ships approaching the island of Taiwan. Amphibious ships would need to get close. Helicopter carriers would need to get somewhat close. They would need to degrade and defeat the air defense systems that have the ability to hit targets out to 20 miles from the island itself in order to launch an effective amphibious assault on the island. So would Taiwan be able to cause enough casualties in phase 3? And again, this is against amphibious landing ships that are approaching the island. This is destroyers and frigates and what have you that are operating very close to the island. And in this phase 3 operation, I think there is a very good chance that you could see enough casualties upon the Chinese to where they are not able to conduct an amphibious landing. And that could very well be a possibility. I think phase 3 would probably be one of the greatest chances for a defeat of Chinese forces. This is where the amphibious landing ships are going to be engaged with Harpoon anti-ship missiles. They could be engaged by Hellfire anti-tank guided weapon systems as far as 8 kilometers from the island by ground launch systems. They could be targeted by indigenous systems. They could be targeted by long-range rocket artillery from Taiwan itself before any actual troops are landed on the island itself. So that is phase 3. Phase 4 is the actual landing campaign itself. And I would define phase 4 as operations to land forces, and then move 20 to 30 miles inland. That would be phase 4. And then during phase 4, we could see major defeats on the beachheads by China. They could take significant casualties. They could be surrounded. We could see large formations being destroyed. We could see formations of the People's Liberation Army moving inland and then suddenly becoming surrounded and attacked by Taiwanese forces, causing horrendous casualties. We could see incredibly heavy fighting outside of Taipei in these areas around the beaches that could cause tactical defeats and many tactical defeats for China and heavy casualties, at which point the Chinese may believe that they have been defeated. The ground forces on the ground could end up seeing defeats in which they are simply not able to continue operations on the ground in Taiwan. It is very possible. Taiwan has a standing 100,000 man professional military, and they would be able to rapidly augment that with reserves into up to a million personnel, possibly. Probably more like 250, 300,000 during the early stages of conflict. But again, during this phase 4 of the operation, it's very likely we could see significant defeats, depending on, in fact, just how good the People's Liberation Army really is. We could see more aggressive and more competent battlefield commanders on the part of Taiwan and better trained soldiers that could, in fact, defeat the People's Liberation Army. And I think that phase 4 is, again, very possible, in which we could see a defeat of the People's Liberation Army, especially as they actually land on these beaches and try to form beachheads. A great opportunity for Taiwan to create a many areas of tactical and strategic victory. And then finally is phase 5. Phase 5 would be where the People's Liberation Army have in fact secured beachheads. They have moved deep inland 30 plus miles. They may or may not have secured Taipei. They could have partially surrounded Taipei, but Taipei is a megacity and would be incredibly challenging to enter and fight the kind of urban warfare that would be required to conquer Taipei. So I'm going to classify Taipei, the conquest of Taipei, as being in phase 5, as would be the moving into these mountainous areas. And you run into these mountains very quickly as you move east. So in phase 5, you would see many of the lowland areas having been somewhat secured by China, but China would have to move inland. They would have to move into these mountains and engage Taiwanese forces that exist in these areas, or they would be engaging in an industrial strength insurgency campaign that probably would never end. So could China see itself being defeated inside of these mountainous areas? Could they find it so difficult to actually move and secure Taipei that that they would eventually withdraw? And the only way I could see this happening is that if the People's Liberation Army took so many casualties during phase 1, 2, 3, and then finally phase 4, the army would have taken massive casualties that it feels it can no longer maneuver, it can no longer enter these mountainous areas and defeat Taiwan, and we would almost have a de facto a draw, or in fact some areas are occupied by China, and then other areas are completely out of China's control. And you could in fact see a defeat in phase 5 the final phase of China. I would say this is the least likely phase where you would see an actual Chinese defeat, as you would probably least likely see a least likely phase in phase 1, a least likely defeat in phase 1. But definitely phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. Again, phase 2 is the Mid-Island campaign or the Straits campaign. 3 is actually moving those amphibious ships to within a few miles of mainland Taiwan. And then finally, phase 4 is the actual landings itself. So all 3 of those phases could see an actual defeat of the People's Liberation Army. So when you hear about that if China were to move against Taiwan, that it's preordained, that Taiwan would be defeated and it would just be a matter of time or could happen swiftly, I completely disagree. And I think the real possibility of China facing a military defeat against Taiwan could, in fact, occur. And this would not include, or it could include, either active or covert United States assistance. I think the more the United States becomes involved, the much less likely it would be for China to defeat Taiwan.